Hey YouTube, today I'm going to be doing a quick video showing you how to remove and replace the steering wheel on your 7th generation Honda Civic or your 2nd generation Acura 1.7 EL. Model years covered is 2001 through 2005, but the procedure is essentially the same for most Honda vehicles. Now on this particular Civic, I've just got it's an LX model and it's just the stock steering wheel. And the other day I was actually at the auto records just finding some parts, and of course I came across this Acura 1.7 EL steering wheel. Same exact steering wheel, perfect fit, but the difference is that it's leather wrapped and it's just got a nicer feel to it. And it was really cheap to buy, so I figured I may as well just switch it out just for the sake of doing so. Now before we do any work, first thing we want to do is disconnect the negative terminal on our battery to de-energize the airbag system. Leave it disconnected for approximately 10 to 15 minutes. So before we do any dismantling work, we want to make sure that we sort of set our steering wheel into the proper position of being centered before we actually start taking things apart. And that just makes it easier for us to put the new steering wheel on and making sure things are aligned. Now I've seen some people say that their alignments are off and then they try to adjust the steering wheel on the steering column, and that's a big no-no. If your alignment's out and your steering wheel is crooked, you actually need to take it to an alignment shop to get the tie rod ends adjusted and not done through the steering wheel. While we're waiting for the airbag system to de-energize over the next 10 to 15 minutes, we can go ahead and start disconnecting things like the cruise control switch assembly from the steering column. And how we're going to do that, if we just use our Phillips screwdriver here and undo the 2 screws securing it to the column. Once the 2 screws have been removed, we can pull the switch assembly away from the column. I'm just going to use a flat bladed screwdriver to push on that tab to disconnect it. And that's what it looks like once it's disconnected. Next, we're going to go to the bottom of the steering wheel and then use a flat bladed screwdriver. We're going to go ahead and remove this lower SRS connector access cover. You can get into it just by prying away and then prying down, exposing the connector. To disconnect it, you just have to simply slide this, or remove, sorry, the clip assembly out of the harness, like so, and then sliding this connector, you can go ahead and disconnect it like this. Now to remove the airbag from the vehicle, on the side of the steering column here, or by the steering wheel, you're going to find a Torx nut on each side of the wheel. Go ahead and undo those. Once we've undone the airbag securing screws on the left and right side of our steering wheel, you can just carefully wiggle the airbag assembly from the steering wheel and remove it from the car. Be extra careful that you don't drop the airbag assembly on the ground. And this is what the airbag looks like once it comes off the steering wheel. Set the airbag somewhere safe. So this is what our steering wheel looks like and the wiring behind it. So we've got our cruise control switch here, right, our airbag signaling wire here, as well as the horn connection. And so we're going to sort of remove all the wires from the various clips, right, and then we're going to pull the steering wheel away from these wires because they stay in here for the clock spring. Now, one of the trickier ones here where I've seen people make a mistake all the time is this horn connector. It's very difficult to remove, but the trick here is you just got to push down on that little tab and then it just comes off like this. Now before we undo the steering wheel, we want to make sure that it is centered, and then using a 19mm socket, we're just going to loosen the steering wheel nut. Once we've broken the steering wheel nut loose, and by the way it's only about 34 foot-pounds so it's not very tight, we can go ahead, make sure the steering wheel is centered still, and then we're going to undo the steering wheel nut partially. And then what we're going to do is we're going to give our steering wheel a few pulls on the top and on the sides, back and forth, to break it loose from the column. And you might need to use both hands here, so I'm not going to be able to videotape it, but the reason why you want to leave the nut on is that you don't want to inadvertently yank this off and then pull all the wiring and snag these connectors, which will then damage the clock spring behind the steering wheel. So after a little bit of pulling and struggling and sort of pushing back and forth, you can see here my steering wheel is nice and loose. And so now, to complete the process, we make sure we're centered still, and then undo our securing nut. And carefully remove the steering wheel while fishing the wires through the hole in the wheel's frame. Now I know I've placed a lot of emphasis on making sure that the steering wheel is straight on the vehicle prior to removing it, but the other thing that you have to pay attention to is this little cam inside here. You can see that it actually moves a little bit to the left and to the right, and it basically is supposed to line up with the groove here in the steering wheel. So permitted that the steering wheel is centered, then this cam should also be vertical. Now remember, that cam here is actually independent of the actual clock spring itself, so just make sure that when you're installing this onto the shaft of the steering column, that cam raised notch fits into this on the steering wheel. So I've fished the wires through my new steering wheel and then carefully aligned everything, making sure that the steering wheel is still centered. Now I'll go ahead and reinstall my securing nut. Go ahead and fish the wires through and reconnect our horn connector, route our airbag connectors down here, and then our cruise connector through the side. And since we've got easy access right now, we may as well go ahead and reinstall our cruise switch. And just simply reinstall by clicking that in and then reinstalling those two screws. Go ahead and replace the airbag unit back into the steering wheel. Reinstall the securing screws on the side of the airbags. Reinstall the airbag connector assembly halves together. Reattach it into the securing clip. And that's what that connector looks like once it's been re-clipped back into the column. We can then finish off by reinstalling the lower cover. Reinstall our battery. Test our horn. And that basically completes it. So if you want, you can take the vehicle for a test drive to make sure that your cruise and everything's working, and to make sure your turn signals and what have you automatically sort of unclick themselves. But I suspect that there shouldn't be any issues. But as you can see here, the Acura 1.7 EL steering wheel looks a lot nicer, right, than the original Civic steering wheel. And you can see here, the color and everything matches up perfectly on this gray and black interior Civic. So I hope you found this video useful and informative. Rate, comment, and subscribe.